and trying to breathe. And today we are talking about some of the major issues that have shaped that campaign and will continue to shape our lives, whatever happens tomorrow. And if you haven't voted yet or know someone who hasn't, please check out www.vote.org. For many New Yorkers, the New York City Police Department is the antithesis of public safety. The atrocities committed by the NYPD, atrocities perpetrated primarily against Black and Brown New Yorkers, are well documented, from Eric Garner to stop and frisk to attacks on protesters this summer. Today, we're going to talk about the movement to reform and defund the NYPD. I'm so excited to hear from these guests today. We're joined by New York City Public Advocate Jumaane Williams, by Darian Agostini of the Public Advocate Office, and by Ashley Sawyer, a member of Communities United for Police Reform. Thank you all so much for taking the time, especially on what I'm sure is a very busy day for all of you, to speak with me and our viewers. I really appreciate it. I'd love to start our conversation with Jumaane, the public advocate for New York City. Can you start by telling us, especially for our viewers who don't live in New York, what role does your office play in defunding the police?
I was on mute. I answered your entire question, so now I don't know if I can repeat it. Thank you for that time and for this space. I'm happy to be with everyone. I'll say it for those outside of New York City, but even those in New York City, I think could use some of that answer as well. The Public Advocate's Office is one of 3 elected citywide positions, one of 4 if you count the Speaker, who's the President of the City Council. And we have some charter mandated roles like legislative, being an ombudsman, charter cop, appointing people to positions, and the bully pulpit, which is also important. And we have tried to steer conversations through reports, through legislation, and through organizing in many different ways, some more successful than others. And the budget and policing is one of them. But I just want to make sure, the one thing I'm hoping that gets done in this whole quagmire we seem to be in is that we frame this as a public safety discussion. We very often focus on policing, and policing is a part of a larger discussion on public safety, and figuring out what policing's role is important in that. What I believe people were trying to point out with the budget fight is, based on what the role should be, there's just an inordinate amount of budget that goes along it, and the other parts of public safety, which actually get to the root of what public safety is, don't get that funding. And that's what the discussion was. And I think some lost the narrative when it comes to defund the police, which I have no issue with that hashtag, but sadly we lost the narrative of people took it and made it become something else, as if people don't want safety in their communities. And so we just launched a 10-point public safety platform. Darren is instrumental in that. I invite everyone to go to advocate.nyc.gov and take a look at that to really figure out and have this discussion in an honest way, hopefully without everyone screaming and saying, look, what is public safety? What does it mean? What's law enforcement's role in it? And do they need $6 billion to $9 billion to do that when we don't necessarily need them responding to things like mental health crises, but the people who need to respond don't have the money to do so?
Yes, and Jumaane, you've called for a response team of mental health care experts to respond to people who are in crisis. What is the status of your proposal, and what are the obstacles that you faced in terms of getting it implemented?
It's interesting. If you speak to people now, thankfully, most folks will tend to starting to lean on the side of, maybe police don't need to be doing this. But when you start to say, well, how do we get that change, and how do we get the money to do that? Everybody starts screaming and yelling. And I'm like, you cannot have a discussion around public safety without a discussion about funding and where funding is going and who funding is going to, period. It's a disingenuous discussion. We've had some movement in this city to do things like crisis intervention teams. Sadly, it was still in the police department, but even that, they just got rid of. We don't know where that money is going. We had something called Thrive NYC, which the primary thing they did good, which is elevate the conversation about mental health, which was good, but they wasted money that we don't even know where that money went. So over $1 billion. Sadly, the mayor that we have, we expected a lot more on these discussions, these fronts, and it just hasn't happened. So it's been a disappointment of the way Mayor Bill de Blasio has had this discussion. And the one point that there seems to have just a complete disagreement with is police should not be the first point of contact for people in mental health crisis. So they kind of want to dance around that and, oh, we'll do this and this and that. And I'm like, no, we need to have, and I have a bill for this, a separate number and a separate infrastructure that people can call so they don't get a criminal response to a mental health crisis. And it's been very tough having that discussion with this administration. An administration, by the way, that came in on the stories of Black and Brown New Yorkers and how they interacted with the police department.
And I'd love to bring Ashley and Darian in on this next question, which is, Jumani just explained the really, big obstacles in the way of implementing this incredibly common sense program, right? If you're sick, you go to a doctor. If you're having a mental health crisis, you don't want the police to show up at your door. So how can you both come from community organizing backgrounds? How can sort of we as a collective organize to overcome these kinds of obstacles? Ashley, I'd love to start with you.
Great, thank you. Thank you again for having this conversation. To your question about how do we overcome these types of obstacles, well, I think part of it is to listen to communities and really hear what they're really asking for. So CPR, Communities United for Police Reform, is made up of a myriad of different organizations that have lots of different views along the spectrum around the defund movement. But at the core of it, people are saying that there are needs in our communities, there's need in our city, in New York, and throughout the country. As Public Advocate Williams mentioned, certainly there's a need for mental health support. At Girls for Gender Equity, which is a part of the Communities United for Police Reform Coalition, we're talking about education. We talk a lot about the ways in which the money that is poured into school policing is money that is not going towards educating young people. That money that isn't going towards school nurses, counselors, educators. In New York City right now, there is a nursing shortage, so school cops take students' temperatures at the door. For students who are going to school in person, it's school cops who are taking their temperatures instead of nurses. And so we have to ask ourselves, why was there enough money to make sure that we had school police, but there wasn't enough money to make sure we had nurses? So to your question, what we can do to overcome that is really help people understand that the conversation isn't just about taking money away from one place, but it's about reinvesting that money into the places where community really, really wants to see it. I've been in a previous panel like this with Public Advocate Williams, and he named a study that I thought was really important about one of the main ways to prevent harm and violence in our communities that young people may or may not engage in is through summer jobs for young people. And so when we invest our money in young people, in the infrastructure that supports them, gives them access to healing and services, then we actually are safer. But there's a misconception that if we take money away from an institution, in our view, policing is inherently racist, and the way that it is conducted is certainly an affront to Black bodies, to trans bodies, and to marginalized people more generally. And so when we take money away from there, we're also demanding that that money be invested into the things that actually are proven through studies after study shown to make us feel safer, is if we invest in education, when we invest in youth jobs, mental health programs, and then also thinking about the folks who are experiencing homelessness. So much of what they're asking for and need is available to us if we would just really reallocate the money to make sure that they have those things.
Yeah, and Ashley, I don't want what you just said, the example you just gave of police officers taking the temperatures of students who are going to school because there aren't enough school nurses. I mean, I almost want to just take a moment to let that sort of sit with our viewers and to sit with myself. I almost can't imagine a better symbol of misplaced priorities. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. And I definitely want to make sure that's something that that we all hear and really listen to. Darian, I'd love to hear from you. You were in the Public Advocate's Office. Now you come from a community organizing background. Could you tell us, how you see people who want to see these types of reforms implemented, what they can be doing?
Yeah, I think as an organizer, to answer the question, well, firstly, I want to echo and uplift everything that the public advocate and Ashley said, because they are amazing and beautiful people. Secondly, I think to answer the question plainly, organizing is one of the most key ways that we can actually overcome a lot of the issues that we have in our communities right now and the issues that we're going to be facing in the future, right? I think here at the OPA, we've really been trying to use organizing as a lens of thinking about healing and connecting with communities in a much more intimate way than your traditional government agency. And I think that's been the history of the public advocates work as an elected official. Is really our literal definition for organizing is the process through which we bring people together to deal with the issues in our communities, right? And that has really been the role that the public advocate has played here in the city, and bringing together community partners like CPR and all of the many grassroots organizations alongside with city agencies and all stakeholders around the city to really think critically about key issues. I think further to further that response, we live, especially now in the age of COVID, we live with multiple crises at once. There are multiple fires happening all the time. And so we really have to have a reimagination of what are we doing to really meet the most basic needs that people have, right? When you think about the communities who have been most directly impacted by COVID, it has been low income Black and brown neighborhoods, right? Neighborhoods that have already had a housing crisis, that already had a healthcare crisis, that already had education crisis, employment crisis, and a crisis around police violence, right? And so we're really trying to use our Redefining Public Safety platform as a strategic tool, or at least as a device to really think about how we addressing these problems holistically, right? How we not just responding to individual blazes, but how are we actually thinking about solving problems in a more holistic manner, which is gonna mean having a hard conversation about budget, about money, about how we prioritize funds. I think it was Dr. Martin Luther King, and I'm paraphrasing this really poorly, but he said, a budget is a moral document, right? And if we look at budgets based on as a viewpoint to what we prioritize in our communities, then we have over prioritized policing over everything. To Ashley's point, right, about police officers taking temperatures in schools before the pandemic, right? They were talking about police officers being guidance counselors and being therapists and being all of these other roles. Why not just invest in the people who are trained to do this? Why not actually give people the tools they need to meet the needs that they have, right? And so we've been really trying to have a intimate dialogue about this, and we've been using, I think, or thinking about the potential for organizing as a tool to really bring us closer to communities and bring our solutions closer to the needs that the communities have.
Absolutely right. And in terms of tools and looking at the budget, that was definitely something that activists that the Public Advocate's Office was organizing around, because as you said, paraphrasing Dr. King, the budgets are moral documents. They reflect our priorities, right? Are we paying for a nurse to take a temperature, or are we paying for a police officer to take a temperature of a student? So let's turn to the city budget for a moment. Public Advocate Williams, could you tell us about what some of the primary differences were between what advocates were calling for and the budget that was passed by the mayor and the city council, especially when it comes to funding policing as opposed to funding other services for community members?
The budget that advocates wanted and what they didn't pretty much got nothing. I mean, based on what it is that they asked for. And, I do give some credit to the speaker for at least acknowledging that we just didn't get any of the things pretty much that we asked for. I'm not even sure that we got a framework moving forward. I would say what was most disappointing to me is we missed an opportunity to have a discussion. And it makes sense. I think people were traumatized. They were going through, as Darren mentioned, multiple layers of pandemics and traumas, and a president who puts out fires with gasoline. And so all those things were happening. But what I'm hoping to try to bring back is this discussion about what public safety is and what it isn't, instead of getting to this tension of the budget. But I want to make clear that the NYPD was probably the only agency that wasn't defunded. All the other agencies were. And so the mayor said that we have a hiring freeze. And to Ashley's point, we said that we can't hire any more teachers, any more nurses, any more doctors. We can't hire anything except for police. We're going to hire a couple thousand more police. So that's what we received. They moved around some money to make it look like, it was a good three-card Monte. We're good at three-card Monte here in New York City, and that happened here in the budget. But it wasn't really what advocates were asking for in terms of the building. A building, for me, was just a number. It was fine. We could have reached it. We didn't. But what's more important to me is we didn't even have a discussion. We didn't even put forth a plan of how we transition from the structure of school safety agents now to a more restorative justice model. We didn't have a discussion, okay, well, what do other agencies need? We had a great discussion about what NYPD needs are, but no discussion about what other agencies need to also keep communities safe. And that's what's missing. And that's what I really hope we have a discussion about, because in it's going to be less now because, this pandemic with $85-90 billion budget, the NYPD is the second largest of that budget. But as was mentioned, we cut some youth jobs in half. And it seems like we never had a question about, well, how is that going to impact public safety? And we send police in to do on the back end so many of the things that if we fund properly in the front end, we wouldn't have to call them.
And it reminds me of a quote from Angela Davis that's kind of stuck with me over the years, which is she said, "Our most difficult and urgent challenge to date is that of creatively exploring new terrains of justice where the prison no longer serves as our major anchor." And I think that the same principle and the same challenge applies to how many of us think of the police. And so what does public safety look like without having police as an anchor? Ashley, I'd love to start with your thoughts on this.
Certainly. I think for too long, people have invested in, and I won't say people, I think budgets and government have invested in policing as the anchor, as you described, of safety. And that's a completely incorrect calculation. We have to, one, acknowledge the fact that police actually cause a lot of harm. And I think within Communities United for Police Reform, there are parents and loved ones of people who've been murdered by police, which is a part that we cannot avoid or forget in this conversation. We have to name the names like Saheed Vassell. We have to talk about Eleanor Bumpers. We have to talk about Eric Garner every single time we have this conversation, so that if we're having a conversation about safety, we are naming that is a part of the conversation. And again, within Communities United for Police Reform, there are organizations that have also talked about police sexual misconduct, people who were sexually harassed or sexually assaulted by police, and police have a great deal of power. And I sort of speak from my experience also as an attorney who used to represent and defend young people who had described for me being strip searched in public, having cavity searches in public, intended to humiliate, particularly young Black youth, intended to humiliate them. And so that's a practice of violence. And so when we talk about safety, we also have to reduce contact that people have with powerful agencies and powerful entities that do harm and do violence to them. We've also put out research about the high rate. Of course, there was a big data dump from ProPublica, but the data showed that girls of color, Black girls in particular in New York, experience extremely high rates of misconduct at the hands of police. And our report was just about the substantiated complaints, not the ones where there's still maybe an open question. So beyond that, what does that look like? That looks like real, meaningful investments in communities and meeting the needs of people who are most marginalized and most vulnerable. So in the case of young people, which is sort of like where I'm coming from in this conversation, I think we have to recognize that when young people engage in harm or violent behavior, often it's attributed to needs that had not been met for them and needs that we as a city could have met. And throughout the country, we see this over and over again. We could have met that need for that young person. We could have provided them with housing. We could have provided them with safety or shelter or someone to talk to, a counselor, but we chose not to provide that for them because we invested that money, as the public advocate named, on that back end, on the belief that we could arrest our way or punish our way into safety. And I believe, and I think most of us understand, that that's actually not a good strategy for creating safety. So the more we invest in community, the more safety we will experience, the more opportunities there are for young people to have athletic programs, educational programs, things to make them feel important and cared for and cherished, the more safety we will experience. One of the other things that we see happening a lot in our communities is gender-based violence, domestic violence, intimate partner violence. So much of that we believe could be avoided if we educated young people in their schools, if we invested in healthy education programs, in teaching young people about consent. We could make the safety that we have dream of and imagine, we could make that possible if we were really willing to change our culture, make the investments in education and providing people with tools to navigate healthy relationships, but we don't make those investments. And this budget, this most recent budget in New York, is a reflection of a really poor strategy of investing or divesting from schools. The New York City Department of Education actually was defunded by $700 million. And so when we talk about that, that piece is the part that's ignored. The Department of Education lost more funding than the NYPD, even though there's a false narrative going around that the NYPD was defunded when that's just not true. And so,
Ashley, I want you raised such an important point about the Department of Education and the contact, often traumatic contact, between young people, especially young people of color, and the police. And my understanding is that the mayor and the city council voted to move oversight for school resource officers, also known as police officers, from the NYPD to the city Department of Education. And what I would love to hear from our guests today is this enough, or do we need police officers out of our schools? Public Advocate Williams, could we start with you?
I mean, the basic answer is no, it's not. And we try to push even more. For those who are not in New York City, I do want to make clear we have school safety agents, a lot of unarmed, some are armed, primarily unarmed and play different roles. And this is different in every city. So we always want to make sure we're speaking apples to apples. Some cities have done things, some haven't. But here, they did just shift money around and not much else. And that's not enough. And we tried to get them to at least commit to a restorative justice. I pushed for at least 2 years. Some people pushing for 1. My understanding is they haven't done either. And it clearly isn't enough. But to your question before, I wanted to make sure I mentioned one of the obstacles for why this is difficult is because the system is operating how it was designed to operate. And so we can never forget about it. That's what makes this struggle so hard. And people don't want to have honest conversations about, the history of policing wasn't about, keeping everybody safe. In the South, it was about returning slaves. In the North, it came from England, where they wanted to crush labor rebellions. In the West, it was about preventing indigenous folks from getting land that was stolen from them to use resources. So that is the history of policing. Now, that doesn't mean everybody now in the police departments believe those things, but that's where it came from. And it's not a coincidence that the people who are most harmed look like the people who were most harmed back then. That's one. And two, law enforcement is just that. And it's for law enforcement. When are they needed? How we should call them. And what we've been doing for too long is allowing unions and police bosses who would make great police bosses in the Jim Crow South really use fear to say, if you do anything to shift this, the whole world will crumble. And it's never been true before. And when you have fear, people do some strange and crazy things. And we're in a time right now where people are masterful using that fear. And we have to push back on it and continue as hard as we can. And also in community, because sometimes communities are trained to believe that public safety equals policing. And we have to do some education to make sure people understand that's not true. And in the broader aspect, understand what it is that actually provides public safety and get the funding to those things.
Yeah, that's such an excellent point. Fear is such a potent motivator. And you're right that sometimes people in communities can believe that they are in danger if there are any changes to the status quo. You mentioned the Police Officers Union, the New York City PBA. Darian, we unfortunately are almost out of time. And Darian, I'd love to close the discussion. Can you tell us a little bit about what role the Officers Union has played in really blocking police reform and accountability?
Yeah, I think the police union would tell you that they are like here for safety and here to like protect New York and do all of the things that we would want them to do. But yet at every single obstacle, every single avenue that we've attempted to make any type of reforms to the NYPD, from the Community Safety Act to the Right to Know Act to getting justice for officers who killed Marley Graham or Everett Garner or Saheed Vassell or Deron Small or Deborah Dana, any of these avenues, and even most recently, the prevention from them putting people into chokeholds. The police unions have been the strongest proponents or the strongest opposition against moving those type of reforms forward, right? They've continually sued, they've continually fearmongered. I think after Eric Garner was killed and the city was in uproar, the president of the police union held a "I Can Breathe" rally with fellow NYPD officers, right? Like, so this is the type of fear mongering, this is the type of like sheer like neglect of like fact and truth that Black and brown communities have lived with for generations, that have been espoused by the police unions, you know, from the top down. And so it's really hard to like quantitatively say in what way the police unions have played like an obstacle in preventing like substantive police reform in New York City, because it's at every avenue, at every juncture, right? There has not been one moment in which, even when we, myself formerly a member of CPR, even when we were willing to, you know, sit down and talk with the NYPD about legislation, they refused, right? And so it's been a really like uphill battle. I think here, working with the public advocate at the OPA, we've been trying to do a lot of work and working with the NYPD around police reform and making sure that we're all on the same page, but it is an extremely difficult task.
Right, because you're really, it's like when you talk about the NYPD, you're also really talking about the union, because they have been one of the sort of most vocal supporters of abuses perpetrated by New York City police officers, like you said, opponents of, you know, the most mild reforms. They have, you know, they have been a roadblock every time. So I am so sorry that we have to end now. We're out of time, but thank you all so much for joining me today. Thank you so much to our viewers for watching. To our viewers, again, thank you for watching. Please don't forget to vote and encourage others to do the same. Full episodes of The Briefing are available as a podcast on Apple Podcasts and wherever you listen to podcasts. We're live again today at 4 p.m. Eastern for the final pre-election day episode of The Count. Follow Appeal News on Facebook and The Appeal on Twitter for the latest news.